Good to see you guys. Aquí estamos. What is now the fourth week of third week, I think. Yeah, of Héroes de Los Ángeles. And I'm glad that both you, Abraham, and Vero were able to watch the video from last week. And I figured we could start off with maybe like a quick little review, of what we talked about last week, even though both of you weren't here. I'm sort of curious to know, what did you two get out of the lesson from last week in talking about writing odes? So what were your thoughts as you watched the video? Vero, Abraham?
So the first thing that came to mind was, as you were asking folks from last class, what do you think of, or what does the idea of hero kind of bring out for you? I thought about, all the concepts that were shared, and mostly it was the identity of a sense of pride, which was interesting because I was trying to figure out, where do we get pride from?
Mm-hmm.
I see a lot of people that kind of like say things like, oh, despite this shit, I was able to overcome and persevere. And I was like, oh, I wonder if someone who's a complete asshole is also a hero. Because they bring out that like las ganas, right? Like las ganas to defy. And if in its own right, that can be considered hero. And so that's definitely one thing that started to mill around in my head.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that was probably the biggest thing. The ode that you guys reviewed was a little difficult for me to understand. I don't know if it was a combination of the type of language that was used, and maybe because it's just, it was just so different than what I am naturally drawn to.
Uh-huh.
But I like the idea of an ode being something where you revere someone that you really admire.
Mm-hmm.
And again, bringing that back to the first idea that I had of like, what does a hero really mean? I was wondering if you could do that in the form of a reflection of what the person brought out in you.
Yeah, I think that's definitely what reflecting on our heroes can do. Depending on how you write it, it is going to make you really think about their actions and what are the things that they did to not only instill pride in themselves but also in you. Because ultimately I think that's part of the reason why we would gravitate towards a person and consider them one of our heroes. It's the fact that they created a sense of pride in us, which is why I think that Javier, for example, choosing to do an ode or something to Mil Máscaras, that's because he felt a sense of pride in himself thanks to the actions of Mil Máscaras. He felt a strong connection in that way. So yeah, I think that it's going to really come down to what your individual connection is with the hero that you choose. Abraham, what do you think about the lesson from last week?
Well, as Vera was saying, kind of reminded me also of Muhammad Ali, who was this black guy who, to many, was really cocky. The first time that I saw him many times, I was like, this guy is one of those people who I don't like, right?
Mm-hmm.
But once you start seeing what he did and accomplished, especially for black people in this country, you can see how a hero builds up the community that follows him. Because every black person was like, he's gonna win, right? They were going for him because he was a great person, and they saw in him themselves. They could achieve that. They saw that inspiration that we're talking about. And so, yeah, that corrido and that romantic style that we're talking about, that kind of has the essence of that, like how we picture that, even if that person is black and white or sometimes even black. We see something good in it, and we try to achieve that or respect that, I guess.
Yeah, I think that, that's a really good point about, the way that the individual might inspire the community that follows them. it's partly because, like in the case of Muhammad Ali, I think a lot of people saw themselves in him. The struggles that he had, his defiance of the government, and his unwillingness to actually go to war in the Vietnam War. He burned his draft card, and because of that, he was actually banned from boxing. That was a huge political statement for somebody that was in their prime. For a boxer that was a world champion at the time. So that's for sure, I think, something to consider as we discuss heroes, right? How do we see ourselves in them? And I think that, again, it comes back to that sense of pride that we develop, thanks to the actions of our hero. So, so it sounds like the Ode by Alexander Posey, the Ode to Sequoia, was maybe something a little challenging. Curious, what were the things that you sort of took from the lesson from last week, having read it and viewed the lesson afterwards? Yeah, either one.
I think I just didn't know how to start writing about the person I'm interested in writing about. One of the things that Francisco was talking about, like, how do you talk about someone that is actually still alive, and how do you make sure that you don't, like, let's say, harm their character, or from your perspective, and like, is that responsible to do? And I that's something I hadn't thought about. Like, that's something I was like, well, it's our perspective, so it's like how they influenced or impacted our lives. But I think that one of the things that I did turn around and think about was like, oh, like, I would be upset if someone did speak ill about, like, someone who I revere or who I consider my hero, right? Like, I'd probably be quick to respond, right? And so that's something that caught my attention that I have never considered. And so back to your question of, like, what did we take from it? I just didn't know how to start, given that insight.
Okay. So maybe the question in your case was really more about how would you write an ode to someone that is still alive? And yeah, that makes sense to me, because an ode is normally written about a person from the past, someone that's no longer with us. It's pretty common for it to be a way of venerating a person that has passed away, and who did leave an impact on people. So writing an ode about a person or a place or a thing that's still here, I can see that being a little challenging. Maybe the corrido, which we'll be covering today, will actually help you with getting started. But I think that the one unifying thing about an ode and a corrido, and about any other form of writing that we might do in honor of someone, is that it's really going to be focused more than anything on the actions of the person that make them exceptional. What do you think, Abraham? What do you think about the ode by Alexander Posey from last week?
Well, I can understand why people sometimes get a little thrown off by the way they speak. But since I read Dante's Inferno, I kind of got like used to that kind of way of speaking. But it does really say so many details on a person that you're trying to commemorate, I guess, or getting his due, especially if it's a person who everybody knows. For example, I knew about that little bit of history, but I didn't remember the actual name of the person. But and then after what she's saying, like, about how do you do a note of a person who's still alive, I kind of run a little bit into that, because the person I wrote about, she's really like self-conscious of things and all that. So when I finished giving my questionnaire and everything, I did my writing, and then I send it to her to review, so she can tell me, oh, I don't want to talk about that, or oh, let me change this out. And pretty much that's the way I got over that kind of thing. Unless it's a surprise and then it's on your own.
Yeah. Yeah, that might be a good piece of advice for everyone in the workshop. Even the people that aren't here right now in the workshop session. If your person is alive that you're writing about, and you want to share your writing about them with them before it gets published, that might be a good way to sort of navigate, some fears you might have about, bringing up touchy subjects. But at the same time, I think that it's more than anything, it's probably an honor for the individual to be written about. And number two, it's also probably fair, I want to say, to show that the person isn't infallible, and that even though they may have made mistakes or had, failures in the past, the fact that they're still here, that they're still, having an impact on people, that's, I think, a very positive way of showing their humanity and helping us as audience members relate with them. Because kind of going back to what Abraham was saying, it's us being able to see ourselves in that person that I think will make them more heroic in our minds, or at least an inspiration in our minds. So, yeah.
And like San Juanito said, I want people to know or tell me what I did to help them when I'm here instead of when I'm dead. Because I totally understand that. Like, some people are at the funeral bringing out flowers and talking the best thing about a person, but when they were alive, they didn't even visit them. So I prefer like the approach of saying, I want to commemorate somebody who's still here, and I want to show them my appreciation.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that, it sounds like we're kind of all sort of seeing why it's important to write about the people that we're hoping to write about. And the approaches that we're covering in this workshop series, they're just different ways of doing almost the same thing, right? And the reason why I chose to do the ode for the first one, after the introduction and asking people to write like a mini bio, I think that the ode works as kind of like the groundwork, the foundation for the corrido, which is the one that we're covering today. Now, the ode, remember, is a way to venerate a person, place, or a thing. And like I said, it's usually a person or something, an event that happened in the past that we're trying to remember now. And given the history of corridos, especially in Mexican culture, the corrido has been around for a long time as a musical form. And it's changed, There's obviously the current corrido, which is really more of like the narco corrido more than anything. And the narco corrido is about usually, kind of like the gangster rap of norteño or of regional Mexican music. And so the corrido has taken on a very different form. But the corrido as a form itself has a very long history. And I'm going to begin presenting my screen here so that we can talk about where it comes from. But obviously, it's good for us to revisit what the ode was, right? What the definition of an ode is. And if you can see the screen now, you'll see our definition for the ode, again, comes from the Greek aidin, meaning to sing or chant, and belongs to the long and varied tradition of lyric poetry. Originally accompanied by music and dance, and later reserved by the Romantic poets to convey their strongest sentiments, the ode can be generalized as a formal address to an event, a person, or a thing not present. So last week, I really tried to draw attention to this idea right here about bringing out the strongest sentiments about that person or the place or event that's being, commemorated. So it was very much about being very like gushy about the person. And I think maybe part of the thing that most people think of when they think of an ode is that it's a formal address. So a lot of times it's written with the idea of it being performed. That's why a lot of times if you look up odes, especially old ones from classic literature, they're going to start with the letter O, O Persephone or O Zeus. It was always that idea of, like this very formal way of talking about the person or the event or the thing. The corrido, on the other hand, it is an ode, right? In the sense that it's written normally to be accompanied by music. But a corrido it kind of does predate that idea too. And the official definition of a corrido is that it's a form of narrative song or verse, popular in Mexico and the southwestern United States. It's related to the Spanish epic ballads known as romances. Corridos have been variously defined. So there's no one single way of defining a corrido, but it does have its connection to the Spanish ballads known as romances. So los romances, or romances, as the Spanish might pronounce it. The classic corrido, as you see here, is a narrative ballad generally consisting of regular verses of 4 octosyllabic lines. So this right here is where the corrido actually takes on a very different kind of structure than the ode does. Odes have usually been written in iambic pentameter. They do use meter in classic poetry a lot of times to write odes, but a corrido, because it is a form of song or verse, it really, really does have a lot more structure. And that structure also includes this additional part of structure where it begins with a verse that sets the theme of the ode, then it tells the story in the rest of the verses, and it ends with a despedida, like a farewell, right? So, I'm sure you guys have probably heard corridos before where they typically say, ya con esta me despido, and or con disculpas al autor or whatever, esta canción ya se acabó, something like that. But those are the and then the tan tan, and those are the typical structures of a corrido. Do either of you have any questions about the definition so far, about what I read so far?
Can you explain? I didn't get the structure part, what makes a corrido,
Yeah.
in terms of the structure, the 4 octaves or something like that.
Yeah. So the 4 octosyllabic lines. So that's definitely a very, it's a very technical thing. So if you break it apart, right, it's 4 lines, but each line is octosyllabic, meaning that each line of a corrido has 8 syllables to it. So here we have an example of a corrido. This is a pretty popular song. I'm sure both of you have heard it before, El Muchacho Alegre. And here you actually have the person that wrote it, Domingo Velarde. I couldn't find, when I was looking up corridos, I couldn't find a song that was actually an ode to an individual that also followed the form. But this one is a classic corrido. It is a corrido that it goes way, way back. There's been a lot of covers of this song. And it actually does follow the actual 4-line structure of each verse. So here you have...
Luis, Sorry, Luis.
No, go ahead.
So would you say that modern corridos, as time has gone by, have less and less use the actual format of it?
Yeah, they definitely have. If you look at a narco corrido, for example, most of them, they're about individuals, right? Like there's the corrido del Chapo Guzman by Los Tucanes de Tijuana. And when I looked up that one, for example, El Chapo Guzman obviously is not a person that most people would consider a hero, being that he was the leader of a cartel. But for the people that he basically was their boss, right? They venerated him as a hero. Um, Los Tucanes de Tijuana were probably paid to write that song for him, or they were gonna die. So like a lot of times that's how a lot of the current narco corridos come about. And because musicians have to also write the accompanying music to it, the structure of the corrido has definitely changed over time.
I did not fucking know that.
Yeah.
What you just said about like, bitch, you better write a song about me or I'm gonna fucking murder you.
Mm-hmm. A very common thing. I mean, there's actually a lot of stories of, cartel leaders actually murdering singer-songwriters in Mexico because they either decided they weren't going to write a corrido about that person, or they wrote a corrido about,
The competition.
their competition. Yeah. And that's really sad. There's a lot of really good artists that died very young because of that. But like that definitely does go to show the change in cultural importance of the corrido. And so, and even if you look at the way that the corrido is used in current, like in the United States specifically, like there's been corridos written about like Cesar Chavez, for example, that are more traditional corridos where they're venerating Cesar Chavez and the work that he did in forming the unions of the for the United Farm Workers, union, and then his other things that he helped promote. So the corrido definitely has changed over time. And this example that I have here is really the only one that I was able to find the lyrics for that actually follow the formal traditional structure of a corrido. So that's partly the reason why we're looking at this one, El Muchacho Alegre. But to go back to the structure, right? As you can see, every verse of this song is 4 lines, right? And each line is octosyllabic. So again, that means octo meaning 8 and syllabic meaning syllables. So here, if you read this line, yo soy el muchacho alegre, that's going to be 8 syllables, right? Yo, 1, soy, 2, el, 3, mu, 4, cha, 5, cho, 6, a is, what is that, 7, le, 8, and then gre, because the song, I mean, it requires, obviously, the word to be finished. So that's actually 9 syllables. As you can see, there's always going to be a little bit of issues there, trying to stay within 8 syllables. But que me amanezco tomando. I think that one's actually 8. Que me amanezco tomando. Again, that's 9. But I think y'all get the point, right? Con mi botella de vino y mi baraja jugando. So those last 2 lines, these are actually 8 syllables each. So does that kind of help answer that question? Can y'all see what the structure is there?
Yeah.
And that's how can we see like why people not using that as much, because it's hard to keep it in the rhythm and the numbers.
Yeah.
But as long as it sounds good, right?
Exactly. And when it's accompanied by music, obviously it's going to be very different, the music itself is going to create the meter naturally, because music is written usually in like a 4/4 beat pattern. So 4/4 meaning, there's 4 counts within a bar. And so yo soy el muchacho alegre would be 2 bars of music, because that fits 8 syllables within, if you were to count, right? The yo soy el muchacho alegre. See, because it's a little bit off, the singer is going to sing it within the 8 counts. So yo soy el muchacho alegre que me amanezco tomando con mi botella de vino y mi baraja jugando. So you start to sort of hear a little bit more once it's performed, the musicality to it. Si quieres saber quién soy, pregúntenselo a Cupido. Yo soy el muchacho alegre del cielo favorecido. So, you start to sort of almost slur some of the words to be able to fit within the 8-syllable count that each line is supposed to have when performing it. Con una baraja nueva los quisiera ver jugar, a ver si conmigo pierden hasta el modito de andar. Eres como la sandía, tienes lo verde por fuera. Si quieres que otro te goce, pídele a Dios que me muera. Si quieres saber quién soy, pregúntenselo a Cupido. Yo soy el muchacho alegre del cielo favorecido. Ya con esta me despido a orillas de un campo verde. Aquí se acaban cantando versos del muchacho alegre. So that's actually the whole song.
So is this a self-ode?
It's this one, yes. This one, it would be considered an auto corrido, ¿verdad? Yo soy el muchacho alegre, obviously speaking in the first person, que me amanezco tomando con mi botella de vino y mi baraja jugando. So here, it's really more of a boast than it is an ode. The difference between an ode is that it's formally addressing, another person, whereas a boast is obviously somebody boasting about themselves. The majority of corridos nowadays are boasts. You have somebody talking about their cuerno de chivo, y que son, el jefe de jefes and all of that stuff. So those corridos would be considered boasts. But a corrido traditionally was actually, an ode to an event. I'm sure you've heard of like el corrido de los Pérez. El corrido de los Pérez is a corrido about a family of young men from the Pérez family that were a part of, I think it was the revolution, la Guerra de la Revolución, and how they ended up all going, their own direction. One went north, one went south, one went east, the other west, and they all ended up becoming farmers or something like that. So, the corrido is it's changed over time, but there has always been that history of the boast in the corrido. So, any questions so far?
I am just looking at, remember the song, Si Adelita se fuera con otro?
What song?
Si Adelita se fuera con otro? So I'm trying to see if they has the count. But I'll do all that in homework.
Yeah, that song, I don't remember that song, but I mean, there are a lot of corridos out there that are about, families or about, people. Like there's the, I think it's called La Tumba de Pancho Villa. That's also a corrido. And that one is about how, the birds, migrate every year to the Tumba de Pancho Villa because, he was such a great person and a leader in the Revolutionary War, right? course, it depends on which side you're on, right? Pancho Villa wasn't exactly always the best. But as a folk hero, a hero to Mexican people, I mean, there were a lot of corridos written about him. So let's see. Abraham's got here. En lo alto de una abrupta serranía, acampado se encontraba un regimiento y una moza que valiente lo seguía, locamente enamorada del sargento. Popular entre la tropa era Adelita, la mujer que el sargento idolatraba, que además de ser valiente era bonita, que hasta el mismo coronel la respetaba. See, that's definitely an ode, right? That's an ode to La Adelita. And the song does, I think, if I remember right, go on to talk about how she actually was important to the tropa of people from, I think in that time it was the Spanish or the Mexican American War that Las Adelitas were a part of.
Yeah, one of my grandmother's great grandmothers, she actually was like her.
Yeah.
So like they took one of my family members. He was young, and she didn't want to leave him by himself, so she went along with the Adelitas and started fighting or cooking mostly.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, Las Adelitas were women that would join the soldiers, and in a lot of cases did actually fight, in the war against the United States to try and preserve the land of Mexico. So yeah, like I said, there's definitely a long tradition of the corrido being used to venerate people, especially people. But you also have corridos that were about like horse races. El Moro de Cumplas. That's an old corrido that's about this horse race that's between two horses that were of high esteem in a particular area of, I think, Chihuahua or Durango, something like that. So there were these famous horses that were raced, and the corrido ends with the despedida saying, something along the lines of, aquí les pide perdón el autor del corrido, el que ganó fue el zaino y no el moro de cumplas, or something like that. So it's about like getting the story right. That's what the corrido is about. So yeah, the corrido definitely has a very, very long existence in Mexican history. So, any questions about the corrido that's used as an example? I think we're good. All right.
I want to listen to it now. I want to hear what it sounds like sung to hopefully give me a better grasp.
Yeah.
Échale, Luis.
Well, we can actually, since we are, in the internet age, let's actually look it up on YouTube. Let's see. Muchacho Alegre. Let's see, there's so many different versions. Yeah.
La de reggaeton.
La de reggaeton. But all right, so for you guys to be able to listen to it, let's listen to the version by one of my favorites. Tan tan. So yeah. Qué
So I
perro.
have a question. So they just have to have the eight syllables, but they're not going to all necessarily have the same rhythm, right? It's just about the 8 syllables.
Well,
Sorry.
so the thing about having that type of structure, about having the 8 syllables, is that if every single line has 8 syllables and you're, performing it, you're going to essentially stress the 8 syllables in a way that makes it actually have a rhythm. So the rhythm may be a little almost like a lullaby, I want to say. It might sound kind of basic, like think old school hip hop from the 80s, right? Old school hip hop from the 80s, every rapper, their rhyme ended at the very end of each line. And it was pretty clear what made up a bar. You know, so as you read aloud your corrido, you're going to have that same sort of thing happen. Corridos that are sung the way that Pedro Infante sang this one in particular, it's going to have a slightly different sound because of the way that he was singing it, right? The musical arrangement caused those really long parts where he was like, "Yo soy el muchacho alegre," right? And there, muchacho, he was, you could barely hear it, but he was slurring the word. He wasn't saying muchacho, he was saying muchacho, so there was that little bit of like, you sort of fudge the the syllable count, even though it's 9 syllables in that line, you can make it 8 by, muchacho. So you say muchacho. So yeah, that. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, you can see some of the parts where you see him extend them, and some of them shorten it, but they mix it together with the next line to make the 8. So it's basically about the timing, like you were saying. So you can, after a while, you can start saying, "Oh, this is why he prolonged that note," and then just follow the next ones fast. So all 2 of them will fit in one of those time gaps, I guess.
Right, and that's what in music would be called a bar. So he completes the bar by dragging out the notes and making, I think in that case it's like probably 16. So 16 of the 4 counts lumped together. So he still is getting that 8. It ends up being like a number game, so he still gets the 8 syllables, but within a 16 point bar, if that makes sense. Yeah, so it's very musical, ultimately. Hoy platiqué con mi gallo is probably a corrido. I mean, that song by Vicente Fernandez, or at least that's the person that I know that sings that song. Hoy platiqué con mi gallo. It's kind of like a corrido about the gallo, the fighting rooster. So yeah, it can be, I guess, considered a corrido because it's venerating the sacrifice of the gallo. So ultimately, with this type of structure, what we're really talking about is meter. Right? So meter is ultimately what is going to make your corrido work. And understanding that the meter on your corrido, if you decide to write one, is going to be 8 syllables. It helps to obviously understand what meter is. So here we have the definition of meter. Meter is a stressed and unstressed syllabic pattern in a verse or within the lines of a poem. Stressed syllables tend to be longer and unstressed shorter. It's also a linguistic sound pattern for verses, giving poetry a rhythmical and melodious sound. So if we go back here and we examine the meter of El Muchacho Alegre. Yo soy el muchacho alegre que me amanezco tomando, con mi botella de vino y mi baraja jugando. So not only are you getting that musical sense from tomando, vino, jugando, right? The O, tomando, jugando. These two words obviously rhyme, but aside from them rhyming, because they have a very similar syllable structure, that meter of que me amanezco y mi baraja jugando, me amanezco tomando y mi baraja jugando, that syllable count is what makes it have that melody to it. I don't have to have the music playing in the background in order for me to be able to perform this and still get a sense of music. Si quieres saber quién soy, pregúntenselo a Cupido. Yo soy el muchacho alegre del cielo favorecido. Sí. Con una baraja nueva los quisiera ver jugar, a ver si conmigo pierden hasta el modito de andar. Eres como la sandía, tienes lo verde por fuera. Si quieres que otro te goce, pídele a Dios que me muera. Si quieres saber quién soy, pregúntenselo a Cupido. Yo soy el muchacho alegre del cielo favorecido. Ya con esta me despido a orillas de un campo verde. Aquí se acaban cantando los versos del muchacho alegre. Y sí, so, muchacho. Yeah. So ultimately, the meter is what's going to actually really make the corrido a corrido. It's what it comes down to. Whereas an ode, I mean, an ode can be written with line breaks anywhere. Classical odes normally were written like sonnets, with iambic pentameter, whether it be an English sonnet or an Italian sonnet, right? The form of an ode, it had a classical form at one point, but any ode now can be written however you want. It's really just the act of writing about something or someone that you want to venerate and sort of elevate. The corrido, it's very, very structured. And so it does the same thing, ultimately. It does venerate and elevate the individual that the corrido is about. But this one has way more structure. And for some people, that structure really helps. So, are there any questions? Yeah. Cool. Well, on the handout, switch back to showing the screen again. So the handout, it is 2 pages. And so if you download it, you'll see this second page that has the definition of meter. It also has these boxes here. And so these boxes, if you'll notice, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 boxes per row. Right? So you have 8 boxes, 4 rows. This right here would be a complete verse for a corrido. Now remember, each box is a single syllable. So if you're using the word like amanezco, for example, you'd have a, ma, ne, ko. Right? So your letters would have to be, split up. So that amanezco is, I think it's, 5 syllables? Amanezco, or 4 syllables. So that means that you would have 4 syllables left in this row. And, most of the time, a corrido will be at least 3 verses, with the final verse being the despedida. So, ya con esta me despido. You have that first line always announcing itself, saying, this is the final one, ya con esta me despido. That is 8 syllables. So if you want to use that same line in your corrido, that's an easy way to meet your 8-syllable count. And then you have another 4 lines, obviously, that wrap up the corrido. And also remember that very first verse is going to set up the corrido. So it's actually going to announce what the song is about or who the song is about. Most of the time, the corrido is narrative, so you may end up using more than one verse to tell the story of the individual that's being written about. So that those verses after the first and before the last verse, they may end up being like 4 or 5 total that you end up using. But it is a highly structured form that hopefully will help you actually really think about, what are the important things that you want to say about hero? What is the way that you want to convey their story? It could be maybe a single event, or it could be, a corrido kind of like the corrido of las Adelitas, where it talks about Adelita and how she was, respected among the soldiers, and that she was there because, she was in love with the sergeant. And then her story continues on to basically say that, she was a key component to the troop, to the battalion. Right? So yeah, how are we feeling about the corrido? Is there anything that needs to be clarified? Any ideas that you have now?
Yo digo que hagamos uno. Pues, ¿qué pasó?
Como que se te fue lo chilango, güey. Very sinaloense there in your accent. What do you think, Vero? How are you feeling about the corrido?
Really intimidated, and then I'm kind of echoing in the back of my head what you said about like 90s rap was kind of like this, and I was like, oh, I know 90s rap. I have to listen to 90s rap and count, and then be like, okay, yeah. More
than 90s rap, I actually recommend 80s rap. Like, listen to some really old school LL Cool J, for example. Like Me and My Radio, that's a really good song that you could totally hear his rhyme structure. Or if you want to listen to, like, say, the Beastie Boys. The Beastie Boys from the 80s, and actually all the way up until their last album, they never really changed their style. They were pretty much stuck in their 80s style. If you get into 90s hip-hop, rappers like, or even 80s hip-hop around like the late 80s, Rakim, for example. Rakim does a really, really good job of doing syllable counts for the bar, but making it sound like he's going into the next line. So Rakim as a lyricist is still to this day, I think, one of the best rappers that you can listen to really understand how caesura really works well, and how enjambment can work in writing. So those two techniques are I think, great examples in Rakim's style. But anybody before Rakim, you're gonna really hear that more formulated structure. Like Run DMC is another really good example. Me and my Adidas, me and my Adidas, right? So you get that like six syllable count that then continues on to build a bar of 16, a count of 16 that completes a full bar. So yeah, and that probably might go over some people's head. Anybody not watching or not here right now, but believe me, it makes sense if you break it down mathematically, and if you use the handout that I provided, and using that 8x4, grid, that's going to really help you start to see how you can structure music and how a corrido ultimately is structured specifically. And I agree with Abraham. Un poco de tequila y ahí vienen los corridos.
Dude, I don't drink. I'm something else.
It doesn't have to be tequila. I mean,
Well, un popito a lo menos.
yeah.
Oh, I don't drink any of that stuff. And smoking makes me sleepy. I'm like,
But I mean, you know, nobody needs to alter their mind in order for the corridos to come out. Believe me, it's very possible to just be in the mood, you know. So yeah. All right. So I think that's it for today. Unless if there's any last questions or comments that you might have. No. All right. So the only other thing before the tan is, you know, for you, Vero, and everybody else that ends up watching the video later, I do just want to remind you guys that you can actually upload your sample photos of your hero to the very first week of the assignments. So, excuse me. Yeah, if you want to share a photo of them, you're more than welcome to do so.
Luis, also, I suggest like the rest of the participants to start gathering photos and images. So when you guys are done, you have all those images that you're collecting or finding out. So I know not everybody has them on their pocket or in their computer or whatever.
Yeah.
So they can start checking them out and you just send them all of them at once. So when me and Javier are working on their portraits, we are able to have as much documents or files to assess and get a good portrait.
Yeah.
I have a question. What is like the artistic creativity of the image itself gonna be completely up to like you and Abram and Javier?
Javier.
Or is that gonna be like yeah, like is it gonna be like caricatured? Is it gonna be like realistic? You know, like are we gonna have a say in like the ideas? Or
I'm basically encouraging them to do it in their own style, but I'm also encouraging them to talk to you, our participants, to really try and capture the essence of your hero.
Yeah, that's what, for example, on my part, I'm waiting for everybody to finish their pieces. And also the questionnaire that Luis gave you is giving us all these things. It's not like we're just coming up with a person that we don't know. We're actually getting as much feedback from you guys as what are we going to incorporate. And as I term of the artistic style, it's going to depend. For example, me, I'm going to try to do whatever comes in mind when I'm reading your pieces. And Javier has his own style as well. So we'll see what's going to come out of this, which is the fun part about it.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, maybe to fill in some of the gaps, I might also actually take on doing a couple of illustrations too. So, and I definitely have my own style, you know, so. But you know, either way, just know that both Abraham and Javier are very talented artists, visual artists, and I feel pretty confident in them being able to work with you in representing your hero in a way that you feel best represents them. So for sure, you know, uploading photos to the first week assignment, you know, that's one way for them to be able to see your hero in real life, or at least photographed, so they can maybe use that as reference material. Your written descriptions about them will probably also inform the way that they create the image or images. It might end up being more than one. And so, yeah, you know, and they'll be speaking with all of you anyway to make sure that they're capturing your hero in their essence. So,
perfect.
Yeah, no problem. All right. Entonces ya con esta me despido. Si quieren saber más, visiten a Cupido. I'm just kidding. Yeah, so tan everyone. That'll be it for this week. It's good to see y'all. Take care.
Yeah, it's great to see you guys. Take care, guys.
Right.
Bye.
Bye.